and I created. Also, I will mention that long ago when you all worked this out with Greg, I was meeting in parallel with Greg, and Greg shared a lot of dreams that he had about data gathering that basically look like what you're about to see. So it's interesting that this all has come together now. But go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Sam. So as Sam kind of mentioned, for the past about 10 months, him and I have been working in conjunction to co-design and develop this kind of food abundant communities assessment, this data analytics tool in order to kind of measure food insecurity based on a lot of the core parameters of the Food Abundance Index. Dean Morel mentioned them earlier. They're affordability, access, diversity, density, and quality. And we kind of took those parameters and have them be the foundation specifically of this new data application tool. But first, there's a lot of talk about the scorecard specifically with the Food Abundance Index. That's one of the portion of the application we're going to take a look at first. And so this specifically mimics the exact scorecard that was in the original Food Abundance Index. And this is what Professor Jones was talking about, focusing on like equity specifically. And this synthesizes all the data that we collect within this tool, whether it be the data that we import from the US Census, so the Western PA Regional Data Center, or the data that's collected on the ground by people going into stores and conducting surveys. That we've also digitized that survey methodology where they can just enter different access points in specifically, and it all gets aggregated to this specific area. In addition, another dimension that we've kind of built out is this survey aspect, and that's the third kind of fundamental component of this application, is getting those in-depth community responses within this survey data, this collection methodology. So currently we have two dimensions built out. We have the access dimension, which was talked about earlier, and we also have the density dimension specifically. And those really heavily rely on kind of the food outlet presence within the communities. And in order to get a better visualization of kind of what these data dimensions really look like, we can transition over to the map software specifically. And so this visualization here focuses primarily on the density, and this encompasses all the food outlets within a specific region. And as you can see, this is the point right here, and then just kind of the different areas around the three rivers that collide within Pittsburgh specifically. And it's interactive, so each food outlet, each dot represents a food outlet specifically. And if we select each food outlet, we can see it's going to tell us, okay, what type of food outlet is it, the name, the zip code specifically. And it also corresponds to the surveying methodology that I'm going to get into a little later in the presentation, where it shows, okay, what percentage of people in this zip code use this store as their primary food outlet, where they get a majority of their food from. And so this correlates directly to the density portion of the scorecard, because density was all about calculating ratios. It calculates, okay, how many convenience stores do we have in the community related to how many grocery stores do we have? And it calculates those and awards scores based on those ratio calculations specifically. For the scorecard, as you can see, we calculated the density ratios, and it shows a pretty poor performance, but this looks at regionally. And within this tool, we have the ability to scope in and scope out, either focusing specifically on a small community, or we can go even to a broader context and look at the entire region. Another interesting dimension I'll show you is access, and this one's really cool. So this is our study area specifically. We looked at these couple of zip codes, and this map shows, it's kind of cluttered, but it shows specifically the transportation stops in correspondence with the primary food outlet types. So the ones we look at usually are supermarkets, grocery stores, and limited assortment stores in Pittsburgh. I'll remove the stops just so you can see. And so each of these corresponds to a food outlet within the community. And when you click on it, you can see all the walking distance stops that are related to that food outlet. These are stops that are within a quarter mile and are accessible by public transportation. And this assessment seeks to decide, okay, if we have a food outlet within a community, but if nobody can get to it via public transportation, how are they going to be able to access that food specifically? So that's kind of one of the questions we wanted to answer. And this focuses a lot on the access dimension of the scorecard, particularly the first dimension, which awards points based on the amount of grocery stores in a community specifically that have public transportation stops within walking distance. Just as an example, we can bring back these public transportation stops, and we can see that if a food outlet within a community does not have any public transportation stops, it will be marked red. And it's easy to identify, okay, which are the food outlets that we need to kind of address and focus on as far as like access for public transportation. And finally, I've kind of referenced it a little bit, but this was a new dimension that we've kind of added to the Food Abundance Index throughout Sam and I's process, and that's the community survey. If you click on the zip code specifically, it does this survey response and shows how many respondents within that particular zip code use public transportation to their primary food outlet specifically. And so if we look at this zip code, this is all kind of mock survey data. None of this is real data yet collected by the survey. But if we have a region like this region, where if say this region were primarily public transportation, if a lot of the respondents were like, yeah, I use the bus to get to my primary food outlet, but the primary food outlet doesn't have any public transportation stops, that shows an issue. And that's just kind of a demonstration of how this tool can really emphasize these issues in the different communities. So finally, I'll dive into kind of the survey portion to go do a brief overview. But pretty much this is the community food abundance survey specifically. And a lot of these questions that were developed for the survey correspond to the original 5 parameters of the Food Abundance Index. Kind of one of the things we wanted to focus on is this equitable data collection. And a big role of the survey is to provide support to different dimensions of the Food Abundance Index that might not be achievable within the current context. The COVID-19 pandemic has made going into grocery stores and doing hour-long surveys of all the inventory pretty difficult and a risk specifically. So by using the survey to kind of support that, by having people report, okay, this is what the store had, this is what the store didn't have, this is what I purchased when I went there, this is what I didn't purchase when I went there, gives us good insight into what the stores possess without us having to go in and risk getting like the COVID-19 disease. And specifically focusing on how we can make it more accessible when we calculate these different dimensions. And so that was a lot of information, but we also use this specifically when we tie it and we export it to this superset data that I'm going to show you, and Sam's going to present specifically, where we can kind of synthesize it with public health data, and we can synthesize it with a lot of the demographic data to really get a holistic view of the region specifically, which we'll be using when we do a report on the Mid-Mon Valley analysis. So I'd like to turn it over to Sam to kind of talk about the outputs of the Food Abundance Index and kind of the impact that this tool can have.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I'll just quickly describe this. That we moved quickly from what Alex just showed you to a pilot project to focus on an area where Food21 is quite active in applying Food21 solutions to food security and food economy development solutions. And so what you see here is we were able to take the data that's published on a monthly basis that comes from Western PA Data Center, and in turn they're sourcing it from the health department. We're able to recategorize it into the Food Abundance Index food outlet categories, but we were also able to focus on, this is one of the challenges, is there's not a lot of data that's readily available in the public space that focuses on like a census tract or a zip code level of resolution. So we were able to do that with a district that we call the Mid-Mon Valley. It constitutes about 7 zip codes, and we have a bunch of projects in Food21 that are active in this area. So we decided to try to apply some of where we have existing data available, we decided to apply some of the analysis from the Food Abundance Index following the Food Abundance Index categorization and methods. Here you can see our findings are that there's a preponderance of restaurants and limited service restaurants and convenience stores. But also, so this is giving us a clue right away on what's going on in this region. But if you could scroll down a bit and see here that we're also looking at employment in all the food economy sectors, where we're pulling in from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics from the government. And if you keep going down here, Alex, we've got from the same Western PA data set that comes from Allegheny County, we can show the business start dates and closing dates for food outlets. So if you keep going down here, Alex, we're mixing in data from partners like Chatham University that look at food processors and craft food producers. And all of this is focusing on, we wanted to see what can we see in these zip codes for the Mid-Mon Valley that will give us a clue and that will about the state of food security and the food economy in this location. And it turns out there's a lot of data, and we think that we can answer a lot of questions right now about what kind of investment should be made in this community, how we can engage with the community to try to improve the situation. Although to Ray's point earlier, and to the point that Alex had in helping to bring surveying into the picture in the Food Abundance Index, our next step is that we hope to be able to carry out ongoing surveying in these districts like this Mid-Mon Valley district. So we're hoping to find partners out there that have a lack of access to data on this resolution of like census tract or zip code level, that we can team up with and carry out this surveying ongoing. This is pretty much how the US Census does it, but the US Census can't zoom in on a monthly basis and gather this data. And this is really the final, last mile for us to be able to get most, if not all, the data that we'll need to answer most of the questions about food security and food abundance if we focus on a district by district level like this. So this is an example of what we're doing. You're going to see a report come out in about a week here from Alex and I that describes this in detail. This dashboard will also go live at that time. And but we just wanted to give you an example about how we're taking the existing food abundance approach and mixing in data from multiple partners and multiple sources to get a richer view that builds on the foundation of Food Abundance Index.
Thanks, Sam. Alex. What do you think, Greg? That looks a lot different than where we started 10 years ago. What do you think?
Yeah, it does.
So I think I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I remember that conversation as well, Sam. I'm surprised that it just all came together. It's amazing.
It did.
It took 10 years.
And so it's good. There's some questions in the